as filking was becoming more and more popular, it's literally become pretty much its own fandom. As you said, it's got its own historical archive. Can you tell us how did it affect you as you were as it was growing? Was there certain parts of it that affected you more than others?
Well, really, from the beginning, it was just finding other people who wanted to do the same things we did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the advantage was that because Fandom or folk fans were everywhere, they were coming in with different sources. Some of them are coming in later on from rock. Our original takeoff had been folk music. And then, of course, in the 50s, we started getting people like Tom Lehrer and the whole, a certain branch of folk like Limelighters and other. I did one lift from a musician performer who did a lot of work for Disney. His name was Terry Carr. He had this deep, furry voice, and he did one song about sitting and listening to animals at night. And that was when he liked to sit and sing. And at one point, I'm in Milwaukee, and Gordy Dixon is the guest of the DeWeeses at their home after a conference. And it was no AC, and it's a very hot night, and people all up and down this middle-class street are going out on their porches in the late evening. And I sat there and sang this, and Gordy was blown away, and he wanted me to sing it every time we met. And I said, it's not really folk, it's just folk music. But he said, it has the right spirit, as he called it. So we pounced on anybody who was into music, as well as science fiction and fantasy. And I was never fussy about the subject, because it came in from at the 1960 Pittsburgh Worldcon. A still active fan named who called himself for a long time, I don't know if he's still doing, called himself Filthy Pierre. Yes. He likes to lead, be the choir director. They had a bulletin board. He posted, anybody who knows Tom Lehrer, come up to room so-and-so and we'll rehearse. And a bunch of us did. Leanne and I did. And what we rehearsed was Tom Lehrer. Everybody had the recording, so we knew we will all go together when we go, etc. And he supplied helicopter beanie hats and choir books, or at least it looked like choir books. And in the break between the masquerade, when the judges are out making their decisions, we all got up on stage and he led us like a choir director, much to the stunned expressions of the audience. Because at the time, filk was something you did and you're interfering with our conversation, go somewhere else. That was one of the first cons where we had people from both East Coast, West Coast, and the center. And we were singing separately all over the hotel in little party rooms and occasionally getting thrown out because we were interfering with the conversation. Or in my case, I had been with a small group, and because we were singing, the other people at the party eventually drifted away. And the hostess came over and said, thank you so much. We've been trying to go to bed for 3 hours. Here's a candy bar for each of you, and check this out. And somebody from the committee said, we're done with the upper part, and there's a piano up there if you guys want it. And all over the hotel, fans gathered, and that one went on till dawn. It was the first one that did go on until dawn. And we had fans from filkers from both coasts and the middle.
That was at PitCon?
PitCon.
Oh.
Which is memorable for a lot of ways. It was also the first art show. I don't know if I mentioned that in reminiscences. And I was pretty active, and I'll hold your coat, B. Joe. What do we do to have an art show? And she basically launched the first time the artists were getting money for their own work rather than getting it once for being paid for the work. And then from that point on, a lot of art went into a lot of private collections, but the artists didn't get another dime. And from that point on, if they wanted to show in the art show, they could, which I'm very happy about. That has grown too with Fandom.
It has. One more thing about filking. Have you noticed that there was a big difference between filking on the East Coast, the West Coast, and in the Midwest?
There was what we called in the Midwest was chaos, because we were a very familiar group, I'll put it that way. We knew each other, and we knew each other's material for the most part. So we could start a theme, and somebody would say, I have a follower, and they might be over at the other side of the room. But that's okay, you have a courtesy. I always tried to stress, this is for everybody. Mm-hmm. And we also have had, down through the years, a fair number of people who want to be musical and aren't very good at it, maybe not very good at all, but you listen politely and you give them their chance. On the West Coast, they set up what was called Bardic, and it has several variants, pick, pass, or play, and chip, etc. It went in exact order. Pick, pass, or play, which works okay if everybody's taking a turn. It gets kind of complicated sometimes when you have one really professional quality folker who has an enormous repertoire and is extremely popular for very good reasons. Every other person is going to say, I pick, I pick, I pick. Well, yeah, we want to hear this person too, but we'd like to hear some of you people who are passing up your chance to perform, or in some cases never get called on at all because they're at the far end of the circle. And I have seen circles that are 60 people large. It takes a long time to sing individual songs with 60 people. Chaos is disorganized and people do get their feelings trampled, but they always get their feelings trampled anywhere. So we try. And the East Coast, they seem to be concentrated around science because a lot of it was coming out of Boston and MIT. And I have been at cons where they say, okay, this filk at a certain hour is going to be all science stuff. And I have in my repertoire a bunch of science things, so I can participate.
Okay, let's move into the 60s. You were one of the people who did an early, I'm gonna go into media. You did an early Star Trek scene. And Star Trek to take over, or let's just say take over the world for a short while in Fandom. How did that affect you, and how did you notice it in the rest of Fandom?
What I was noticing is the gender balance. That was immediate, and it was a shock, I think, to a lot of the men who had been involved in Fandom for a very long time. I had been publishing at that point for years, and I didn't think anything about it. And they were very new. They wanted to publish fanzines immediately. But the major reaction of an awful lot of the women who came in is said, you mean science fiction can be about character and ideas about society? I thought it was all about rocket ships, which they weren't that interested in. A rocket ship was like a car to get you somewhere. And all of a sudden they are flooding into all the conventions and they want to publish fanzines and they know nothing about publishing. And a good friend, Deborah Langston in Brooklyn, wanted to put out a really, really good, and she's, I can't get the artwork. I can do the typing and everything. She was taking professionally taking it to the A.V. Dick Publishing Company. And they said, yes, we can cut art on stencil and it will cost you da, da, da. And I said, nonsense, send it to me, I'll cut it. I took great pride in being able to cut decent artwork faithfully. And I won't charge you a dime. And she said, how'd you do that? And okay, first you want to go down and get a shade plan sheet, and you need a light scope and da, 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 and explained the mechanics of publishing artwork and got them off on the right foot. Kay and I were looking at a lot of what we call fanfic now. It was a lot of women suddenly, in particular women, doing what if stories, not all romances, but using the characters in Star Trek. And we were more interested in, having been science fiction fans of the whole genre, we were more, how does Dr. McCoy's equipment work? What after this episode, what happens to the society? How did they get started with it? How did they get casting? The actual making of Star Trek. So 90% of ours was nonfiction. It was how-tos and how did. And people said, well, when's the next issue? And I said, we've said everything that we wanted to say in 2 issues. So why keep publishing? Did the same thing with Femzine, because I can't keep publishing Femzine because there are no more submissions. There weren't enough women to keep it going in the early 50s. But it was an attempt to be an all women femme fans. And there are still people arguing that the proper plural is fen, not fans. Not very many, but a few. So we wanted to invent our own. Every subculture has its own lingo. So we were a proud and lonely group, and we wanted to have our own. The mundanes, which later became muggles, since thanks to, but the same thing, they don't get us. They don't understand. They don't read the same things we do.
So did the breakout of Star Trek really affect the general fandom, or was it more quickly spilling out into its own?
It started on its own fairly quickly, but a great number of the women in particular had a foot in both camps, because from that point on, they didn't know there were other people reading science fiction, and they had kept it a secret from their female friends, because who reads that stuff? Mm-hmm. Well, I do. And now it was becoming okay because Star Trek became such a hit. And they felt it gave them license to brag, in effect, that I'm a fan too, etc. And it certainly changed the complexion of fandom in general. You started getting more fanzines, more costuming. Mm-hmm. There were a number of, and first you had the gaming conventions, which again started with spin-offs. Chess being written into a number, Stand on Zanzibar and various other books by pros had featured prominent chess games, etc. And we just thought of them as spin-offs from us, because we was here first. But I just thought of it as it's growing. The children are going out into the world and they're finding their own interests.
Well, that was true. I know you mentioned that fandom, especially the men, found it as a shock when women.
In early days, yes.
I found it as a good shock, but there
were plenty of shy or otherwise out of the mainstream. Mm-hmm. And doesn't anybody else read what I read? Doesn't anybody else appreciate what I appreciate? And then thanks to the Chawoom effect that Star Trek gave to the whole thing, they were able to get in there too and say, ha, I have a family now. That was part of, it's a culture, basically, but you had friendships and you had non-friendships. So it was people who, well, that's not why I'm in science fiction or fandom. It's, well, that's your problem. There's enough room for everybody.
Well, you've been in fandom for close to 70 years.
Yes.
And you've done many different things, but how has your own personal focus changed over the years?
Well, it's a little bit like a mother or grandmother, having watched the kids grow up. Okay, they want to do that. Okay, as long as they're honest, or as my mother taught me, and I understand Feynman's wife also said the same thing. If you're not hurting anybody or breaking a law, what do you care what other people think? And that was basically my philosophy from an early age. Well, they don't understand what I'm doing, and why doesn't she stop that? She's making fun of things. Why should I? I'm not making fun of you, are I? I'm making fun of something else. Or why is she singing about that? Nobody sings about that. Well, that's their problem. I know people who are interested in that, so I will sing it, etc. And the advantage of having your children go in different directions is there's room for everybody. I mean, if you want a costume, you want a game, you want to do filk, you want to become a pro writer, you want to become an artist. And then the printing, they discovered prints, which made it possible for a lot more fans to acquire beautiful art hanging on their walls that they didn't have to spend the child for.
Right.
I'm not going to sell my children so I can buy a Michael Whalen or whatever.
That's true. The people have a chance to explore all kinds of different areas these days.
As long as you're not breaking the law, why should other people care? Because it's different. You're not following. Well, we never have. We're the people who are always have been outside a little bit. You look at some trends in society, well, everybody must dress this way. Why? It's not convenient and I don't like it. I think it's ugly. So I'm going to wear this. In shopping, preschool shopping, my mother took me, I think I was a sophomore in high school. And it was the era of the poodle skirt. And I came across, this is a poodle skirt. It's felt. It's got diagonal panels and each one's a different color. I want this one. And she said, are you sure? I said, yeah, I can be General Jinjur. Who had heard of Oz at that point? I had. And I was General Jinjur. And I got stared at a lot at high school, but I didn't care. So it wasn't the right kind of poodle skirt. It didn't have a poodle on it, for one thing.
That's for sure.
But it's encouraging listening to your own drummer, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So did you do that when you started writing professionally? Did you want to be a writer all the time, or did you evolve into it?
Again, I have to credit my sainted mother. I was a little kid, very little, probably 4 or 5. I came rushing in. I was an only due to medical things. My parents were Rh positive, and my mother could never bear any more children. She had a lot of miscarriages, but the blood types don't mix. Now they can do it. They can actually give the baby a transfusion in the womb. But now back then, no, I was lucky to have gotten out alive. I was a preemie, so I survived, but nobody else did. So I got all that concentration that she had as a mother, which must have been difficult at times because I was not your normal child. And I came rushing in telling her how the ants were building a castle. And I heard them discussing it. And she said, wait a minute, did you really hear them? Well, that's what they would have said. If they could talk, that's what they would have said while they were building the castle. Okay, telling people that you actually heard them, that's a lie. But telling the story that you imagined them, wait a minute, I'll get a piece of paper. You draw pictures of the ants and I'll write down what they said. And from that moment on, I'm off. I did cartoons. And when I was 11, I did a novel, probably 6,000 or 7,000 words, with every other page a picture of a cowboy on a horse. I was a girl and I was 11 and I loved horses and I loved cowboy movies. And she sent it to Putnam's. And I was horrified. No, that's real people. Real people are writers, the books I love. And it came back with a very nice, does not meet our needs at this time, but keep trying, keep working at it. And I thought, well, that's that. Of course, I'm not a real writer. But when I kept writing this, that, and the other, and like a lot of other onlys, I put together bits and pieces of things, concocting my own planet, like Tolkien did, his own universe. Well, this is separate. Of course, you're not going to do anything. It's fun. Creating different animals, different cultures, different languages. I was really into languages at the time. And some years later, I became a mommy myself. And the kids, it's summer. This nice tree, there's a playpen. I've got a portable typewriter. Kid goes in the playpen, nice breezes, playing with his rattle and just baby toys. And I'm typing, I'm going to tell us one of the stories from my planet. And I did, including all the details, every possible detail of the animals, the languages, the religions, the geography, the wars, da, 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 da. 250,000 words on paper with no margins, right out to the edges, top and bottom. And I thought, well, I've done that. And I put it away. And I kept reading, and I met Marion through letters originally and eventually in person. She took a tour, driving all the way from New York to California at one point, and stopped at our place. And what are you doing? Because at this point, I'd become interested in her writing. And she explained, you don't want to get involved, because she had been divorced and her entire income was her writing. And what she told me about that was grim, I'll put it that way. She wrote True Deep Confessions and a whole bunch of stuff. And it's, oh, what do you got in the drawer? Okay, magic computer things going on here. And she pulled out that manuscript and she started leafing through it and reading and reading and reading. She was there for 3 or 4 days. And she said, oh, this has possibilities. It's too long, but it has possibilities. So under her guidance and working with her occasionally, the first thing I sold, we had been kicking back and forth by mail possibility. What would society be like if there were no women? I was interested in it for academic reasons. She was interested in very personal reasons. And she sent me something and I retyped it, put in my own ideas and sent it back and said, like this. And she said, do you mind if I submit this? Oh, no, I mean, it's yours now. And she sent it off to Avram Davidson, who at the time was in charge of editing F&SF. And Avram sent her a letter that said, I don't really like this, but I'm going to buy it. And she said he wanted a contract right now. And she didn't have time to get back to me, so she picked a pen name. At the time, she was very much into Gilbert and Sullivan, so I became John J. Wells. My maiden name was Wellens, which she knew since we'd been corresponding before I married. And that was the first sale. I got a small amount. Gee, there's nothing to being an author if you're writing the coattails of an established author. But she kept encouraging me. Okay, 3 chapters in outline was the pattern back then. And I kept saying, okay, I got an idea for, can I write a novel? Well, I've already written 250,000. I probably can write 70,000. So I kept submitting. And eventually, Terry Carr was a first reader at Ace Books at the time. And he sent me a note and he said, in the immortal words of Lee Hoffman, you have just lost your return postage. She apparently invented that terminology, which meant contract follows, you have sold a book. Now all you gotta do is write it. It was an ace double, and then I sold another ace double. So I guess I didn't do anything for a while, and then I got more opportunities. So, and eventually the one that had started at 250,000 words ended up at 80,000 with all the excess fat, and you don't really need these details, trimmed out, and a lot more maturity of age added in. And I was at a mini-con, and Lester Del Rey and Judy Lynn were guests, and Lester crooked a finger at me, and I thought, what have I done? Lester Del Rey is calling me over there. And Virginia Kid's newest young agent had sold it first crack out of the box. So that's how I sold a real book all by myself. I didn't have to have help from, but I didn't do it all by myself because Marion had told me, you've got the germ of an idea here, but you've got all this stuff that nobody wants to read 250,000 words about. Not then, they didn't. Now if it said Tolkien on it, they probably would. So,
well, nowadays, millions of words seem to be filling into some of the.
well, I've heard at a number of panels at different conventions by authors who said, I didn't plan to make it a series. Bob Vardaman once said he and a buddy originally cooked up an idea for a novel, and they went and approached the publisher, and he said, can you make it 10? And I said, well, we hadn't planned to, but that it's a monetary decision on the parts of publishers. More books sell more. And it's, in a way, it's also the responsibility of the readers, because Gene DeWeese and I both, he was managing to sell things, and we both got tapped to do for Valentine, one of their, what I call women's division. Would we do a series of romances based on astrology? I have sold articles about astrology. My mother didn't quite believe, but she bought the magazine. So I read them and I knew that the drill, the magic words to fill it out and all the proper symbols and everything. And okay. And my agent at the time, Jim Allen with Virginia Kids Agency, said, oh, the one she assigned you. That's the heroine's birthday is the editor. She had better be Miss Wonderful all the way through your book, which I didn't know anything about New Orleans, which is where it was assigned, but I knew fans in New Orleans. So I could write to them and say, tell me about, I'm thinking of doing this. And Oh, they're doing remodeling there. So they're tearing up the whole street. Don't do this. And this was from a very wealthy fan who lived in New Orleans. And after the book, Slim Little Romance volume came out, he apparently bought a huge supply and passed them out to all his friends because I had put a dedication in to him. Look, I'm in a book. And I thought, you could buy and sell me 20 times over with the background you've got. But small gestures to fans who have helped you, always a nice courtesy. Mm-hmm. And they came back and my agent said, she's been looking at the one she assigned to you that you picked out right away. Hammurabi's Babylon, 1776 BC. Well, I knew astrology did not exist until the Chaldeans. There is no astrology. But I want the historical period. I get to do all kinds of research and buy expensive books that I can take off my taxes. And it's a period I'm fascinated with. And finally, he went and negotiated, and she came back and says, well, how about we forget it as astrology and make it just a straight historical romance? And he said, more money, more time. So I got a year to write it and all these wonderful books. And it sold like cupcakes because it was part of a dump for Christmas. And I've still got copies because at one point they called, well, I was shopping, I think, and said, we're cleaning out our warehouse. You want what's left? Well, Buck figured a couple of boxes maybe. And then the semi pulled in and the guy offloaded a skid. I had to leave quite a few behind, but I still have copies of that one. Yeah. But I had a lot of fun writing it. So, and over the years, you do these things, and sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't. And I still had filk. I could always go back to filk. I always had the music. Well, and watching it grow, all these different types of filk, some of which I may not understand what they're singing about because I haven't seen that movie. I'm not into that particular book series, but the music is wonderful. And it'll hold me even when I don't know what they're singing about, really.
Well, you've stayed a fan all these years.
Yeah, well, it's home. It's a home in a way. I've lived in a lot of different places, so.
Well, you've met a lot of people in science fiction, both fans and pros.
Yes.
Can you tell us some of the ones that you find most memorable? You've mentioned a couple like Block.
Well, Harlan, as I said, I knew from when we were both teenagers. Mm-hmm. And I decided fairly young, side note, I said I went to a large high school. When I was a senior, they actually offered a class in psychology. And I fascinated with what makes people tick. And I took it, and the teacher later became a professor at Brown University. So it was that quality of class. And I became fascinated with analyzing. And I had briefly thought about maybe I could go into psychology, especially after the teaching curriculum I've got, how people learn, how people do these. And then I found that there's something about my face that makes people, perfect strangers, come up and tell me horrible stories about how their brother was in a truck accident and got blown up and they can't even find his body. But thank you for listening because I feel so much better now. And I didn't. And I decided I don't want to do this for a living. But I've always noted, shall I say, different behaviors. And Harlan fits one that there is only one word to describe Harlan: mercurial. Because it goes, I have watched him do wonderful things. I have watched him, no, don't do that. This is going to turn out badly. I have watched him actually do it was not intended as a comic shtick. The summer that we were at one convention, we were going to get married in August, but at that point, this is a big room party. We're snogging on the bed, along with a lot of other people at different. Harlan is staging his performance. That's the only way I know how to describe it, a description of whatever is going on. And he starts to leave the room, and he has his hand on the doorknob. And he said, the joke is, don't send a dog out on a night like that. And he turns the knob and the door doesn't open. And his audience is, okay, that was supposed to be your exit line, wasn't it, Harlan? And he did this to himself a great number of times, but he also did some really nice, wonderful things. So mercurial, as I say. I have already related for Mowgli, our computer host, a story about Gene Wolfe, who Buck got in Corfee, argued about one thing in one of his books, and Gene took umbrage and then came back and said, you're right. I looked it up and I double checked and you were right. And from that point, he and Buck became regular correspondents, and I met him at a number of cons and found him very interesting, quite sympathetic, very well read, but with a very different sense of humor and of the world. And he called us. We lived on a very isolated 3-story farmhouse in the middle of nowhere in Indiana. He lived in Barrington, Illinois, which is an outer suburb of the Chicago region. He said, Buck, you collect guns, you've got a Luger, haven't you? And Buck said, well, I have an American patent copy of a Luger. Well, it doesn't matter, it's a Luger. I want to come down and shoot a Luger. Okay, we have a backstop, and we're out in the country where we're not offending anybody. And Buck's a hunter. He uses guns for real purpose, like eating. I learned to cook rabbit. I learned to cook quail. I learned to cook pheasant. All sorts of interesting game. And he drives down from Barrington, which I figure is probably 250, 300 miles to eastern Indiana. And he, oh, we're so happy to see you. He said, oh, well, I came through this town west of you and got a room at the hotel because I am not going to be able to drive all the way back. And where's the Luger? Okay, fine. He's all enthusiastic, like a little boy. I'm going to play with a gun. Except he had been in the war and he appreciated and knew how to treat them respectfully and not use them irresponsibly. And we had a backstop. And he brought down the Luger and he says, I have something to put up on the backstop. Okay, we have nails. It's a cheap blue light special windbreaker jacket. It's extra small. Not gonna fit Gene. Not gonna fit any of us. Okay, we put it up on and he fires several shots at the windbreaker. He says, well, that didn't make very big holes. Don't you have anything bigger? And Buck says, well, I've got a 357. I don't use it. I got it for a collection item, but yeah, I've got ammo. Well, let's try that. So he goes back and gets his locked gun cabinet open and gets the 357, brings it down, bam, bam, bam. Oh, that's more like it. Very big holes. Goes to his car, gets out a fancy camera, walks up close, takes pictures of the windbreaker jacket. And puts the camera back in its lockbox. And he says, you know, they got a wonderful looking restaurant at that hotel. Why don't I take you guys over and we'll have dinner? Fine, we all pile in the car, go over and have dinner. And as Buck says, we solve all the problems of the world. Then we drive back. And it's getting to be twilight, not quite. And he says, well, it's been just wonderful giving us all this thanks for our hospitality and getting used to the guns. And now I'm going to head back to the hotel. And I said, don't you want the jacket? And he said, I don't want it. It's full of holes. At which point Buck finally said, okay, what? And he says, my publisher said he wanted a jacket shot for my next book to put on the bio part. And he says goodbye, gets in his car, goes back to the hotel, and presumably the next day drove all the way back to Barrington, Illinois. I still have the jacket. And he allowed Buck to take pictures of him firing the Luger. So I have proof that this actually happened. It isn't a vanished fairy tale. I was there. I saw it. I was there, Charlie. The man was different. So
A bit of
I
an
hope his publisher was
elaborate,
happy. So
a bit of an elaborate joke, I would say. But
yeah,
something
it's an expensive joke, but
and something you can still tell.
and I still have the proof. I have lots of these stories. So if you live long enough and you don't lose your marbles,
Well,
it's not all of them anyway.
if you want to recount us with one or two more, we can.
Well, everybody, I think probably everyone knows the St. Louis story. St. Louiscon 69, the con, one of the cons from hell, old con from hell. The hotel did not want us, and it made every proof of it. A fan friend who was a newspaper worker said it wasn't just us. He said months later, they had a convention of newspaper editors there, and the hotel treated them just as badly as it did us. They don't want people coming in and messing up their nice hotel. But once you got past that, it was a good gathering, was large, very large. And we had the incident of the screen. One kid came to the masquerade as Charlie Brown with the kite, and a very good job he did. And he was one of the winners, and he's finally up on the stage where they had one of these enormous screens, movie screens for later showings. And he tripped over the kite, being in character, and backed up against the screen, which tore horizontally about 6 or 8 feet. And his immediate reaction was devastation, and people were gasping. And Harlan leaped on stage and said, "Everybody pony up 5. We can pay the hotel, and no problem." And everybody did. And the treasurer of the committee was at the back because they had a cash bar. And she was a teacher in a Catholic school during the school year, and was a cocktail waitress in the summer. So she had been trading cocktail stories with the barman. And he said, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen anything like that. You people must like each other." He said, "I've been doing conventions and I've never seen this." So it was a big success, huge collection of money, pay for the screen. We're all good. Next night, goodwill everywhere. Harlan's up on stage. And he announces we had this, and with the hotel said replacing the screen would cost this. So we have an extra. So I'm going to donate it to my writer's school. And Elliot Shorter stood up in the audience. Apparently they already had a shtick planned. It's a very old one where the white liberal gives the black in the deep South a ride in his trunk till they get up north, and then lets him out and starts calling him brother. And he says, "Who you call him brother, white boy?" That wasn't it. Elliot was mad. Elliot was mistaken for Rosie Greer frequently until he started signing autographs and quit arguing. And he was furious. And it took Harlan a while to, you do not argue with a man this size. This is not funny. And he thought, well, all right, a bunch of you cheapskates make such a noise about it. It eventually went into a rescue fund that was assigned to a committee of fans, people who were lawyers. to administrate and invest. So if this incident ever happened, something like it ever happened again at a Worldcon, we could have the money to pay the hotel and keep everything simpatico. But you felt like, Harlan, how could you go from what a hero, what a magnificent gesture, perfect, to this in one day? And that hotel, let's just say we went back, they finally said, it's better. It's under new management. So we went back and said, okay. We stood at the elevator and the doors opened about 6 inches and we could hear mechanics up there saying, that wasn't it, Joe, try the other one. So we went over to the other elevator, which seemed to be working okay. I came in the room and there's the bathtub with claw feet, just like before. And there's the lavatory with hot, cold, and ice water that all run tepid. This is the same hotel. And they put the huckster room on the 76th floor, and they had live operators at the elevators who didn't go higher than 70. And they tended to lock their elevators when they went off shift. At the first convention at Louisville in '69, parties were all on the floors, and then they found out the elevators don't work. So people were going downstairs, and there were no numbers of what floor you're on the exit doors. So one of the major publishers' wives kept going down and down and down and down and down, and she went through a door, and it closed behind her, and she's in the basement. And there's no handle, there's no knob on the back of the door. And there's a salesman down there with his samples case, and he did the same thing, and they're both lost. And they spend the next hour looking for a telephone or something. And she had to be taken to the hospital for a shot of Valium by the time they were rescued, because she had visions of, when this hotel is demolished in 50 years, they're going to find 2 skeletons in the basement. We are never going to get out of here. And there are so many stories of an encounter in Minneapolis, or well, no, it was Milwaukee. And we were sharing the hotel with a Polish wedding. And we had a number of SCA Viking reenactors with the horned helmets and the furs. And we encountered somebody from the wedding dressed in sort of a tuxedo and a very large drink. And the Viking had a very large drink and a club. And they're not liking each other very much. And I picked up my guitar and I headed for my room, because I do not want to be in the middle of whatever is going to happen. Encounters with mundanes go along with, they still don't quite understand. Oh, you're one of those Trekkie people. No, not really. They even have their designation. You have Trekkies and Trekkers. Are we running out of juice? Or we've lost somebody?
No, I think we're okay.
Okay.
We can go for a little bit longer. We're going for a couple of hours now, but
well, my BFF forever, Bev DeWeese, ended up taking over the Milwaukee library. They didn't know it at the time, and she said they did a historical, back in the days when they had the huge tapes. They said some old geezer came in and he had been tapped as one of the original inhabitants or something. Went over and planked in the chair and says, I hope you got a lot of those, honey, because I got a lot to talk about. And that's the situation I'm in. I mean, I'll keep going as long as you.
Well, shall we let open it up for some questions?
Fine with me.
Okay. So everyone who's with us,
We haven't answered all the questions of the universe?
uh,
Not yet?
nope, we still have a number left to go. Okay, so everyone, if you're interested, have some questions
No
to ask.
questions, we've answered them all.
Well, sure, we've asked a lot. And okay, so do we?
They're fed up.
Well, I guess we don't have any at this point. So we're okay. Is there anything specific that you'd last comment or anything that you'd like to make, and we can go from
Well,
give you a chance to take a break.
When this pandemic started back in sort of in a small town, I work at the Walmart, and a lot of my coworkers are, when do we get back to normal? And I had to tell them probably never, because growing up in the Depression and then World War II, you've learned very quickly in your life that nothing lasts forever, and it's going to change, and it's going to change in ways that you can't possibly foresee. And, oh, you mean we've got a polio vaccine? All those times we had to put in the cans in the movies and everywhere else actually paid off. Who would have thought? Not in the 30s, certainly, because we got everything that came down the pike. But what I love about fans and filking is the joke used to be, we have broad minds, very shallow, but very broad reaching, which is quite true, because you name a topic in filking, in general fandom. At PitCon in '60, John W. Campbell was giving a panel, well, not a panel, he was by himself pretty much, explaining why it was no longer astounding, it was going to be analog. And he mentioned a very complicated machine of engineering. And he says, now who knows what I'm talking about? And about 20 hands went up in the audience. Any subject you care to touch on and say, do you know what I'm talking about? Your audience is going to be full of people of whatever discipline. I don't care if it's art, music, engineering, STEM, what, space travel. Oh yeah, we build those. You know, whatever. People who work in NASA, people who are artists, totally dedicated. Somebody else who has studied the 12th century at great length, and you can't do that in your fiction. They didn't do that back then. They did, that's not, let me tell you how they did it. And it also becomes a repository for writers, because if once they know what your specialties and what your area of interests are, they can tap you if they have a problem. I did. I'm assigned to write a science fiction series, sort of modeled on the Dallas. It was supposed to be generational. I do not have a STEM education. I'm an artist and a musician, et cetera, But I had a friend who worked at Sandia. He couldn't take his work home. It was cured in a safe or something overnight. And then, Gary, could you design me a star drive? What would this ship look like? If theoretically, what would it look like? Because every author who does faster than light travel has come up with different types of construction to handle this still unknown problem. And I said, no numbers, please. I don't do math. And he was a filker. Now, he had a wonderful 5-note bass tune and a really gorgeous guitar. And he sent me, sure, he sent me back this page. And I look at the first page. It has pictures of the design of this potential spaceship. Designed for a faster than light drive. Sounds good, won't work. How do we know? So apparently the guys at Sandy had already experimented, but it should have worked. I turned the page and it's nothing but mathematical formula. Well, thank you, Gary. This is not going to help me any, but the description of how the ship would look, that's really helpful. And another very close friend and I kicked around ideas. Actually, when we became super letter traders during the Star Trek era, commenting on each episode, sometimes writing 14 pages per week back and forth to each other on all kinds of subjects. And she and I kicked around an idea, maybe an archaeological team made up of all different kinds of humanoid species on an alien planet, and they're doing this and they're doing this, and what would they da 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 da. And they finally got a chance to write that book. And I dedicated, she is one of the dedicatees. We finally got there. We finally got it in print because she's not a writer. She could have been, but she had 4 kids to raise. And that kind of gets in the way of some women would have been some wonderful writers, like our Rowling character, Lois McMaster Majold. Her earliest writing was done on a yellow pad in laundromats and waiting at school functions, waiting for the kids to come out of the school so I can drive them home, sit there, right. And she said, I sold the first book. But I sold a book to Bain Books, Shards of Honor. And he said, here's a contract for 4. Can you finish them in a year? And it took me 2 years to write the first one, with all the kids and the interruptions for school functions and wiping bloody noses. And it's a sort of a double life for a lot of women writers, because if they have a family, the men don't seem to. Well, my mother she lived with us for the last years of her life. And since Buck was writing too, he understood. I'd be finishing up and on a typewriter, the final draft. And final draft doesn't mean you copy it exactly. It means you catch all those things you should have caught in at least the second draft, or the rereading the first draft and making lots of. And I'd be typing and typing and typing and typing and typing, and it's 11. And my mother says, aren't you going to bed tonight? And I said, no, I have to finish this chapter. I have to see how it comes out. Buck had already said, I'll see you in the morning, and gone to bed, because that's the way you work. Or as one woman writer said, I put myself in the playpen and let the kids have the house. That way I could type unbothered.
I think we're pretty much coming to an end. Want to really thank you. It was lots of material and lots of interesting things. I had a great time.
Too many to go.
Well,
it's a long life.
Yeah, there's always more to tell. Perhaps another time. But thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.